Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our 9th annual Wild Wisconsin Winter Web Conference. I'm Jamie Machik with the Wisconsin Valley Library Service, and this is our closing session for the conference. And assisting me is Jean Anderson with the South Central Library System. We're so glad you joined us. Our presenter for this closing session is Beck Tench, and Beck is an instructor and PhD candidate at the University of Washington Information School in Seattle. She's going to be talking about how do we stay true to ourselves in time of stress? How do we practice? How do we practice ways to help us accept vulnerability in our work and in our lives? So Beck, please begin.
Thank you, Jamie. So I've known that I'd be giving a talk about staying true to yourself in times of stress since May of last year. And that has been 8 months that I've had to be stressed about it. I've had 8 months of stressful events and my responses to them that fall woefully short of anything that I would recommend to another person. And as the deadline for this talk neared, I realized that I wasn't going to become some model self in times of stress, and that I had no other choice but to represent myself as someone who, more often than not, is regularly consumed by self-doubt and at times even self-hatred in times of stress. I want you to know that I am someone who feels anxiety for months on end. And when there's a reprieve, I scan the horizon for something in the future to worry about. And while I have been actively working and speaking on such matters for the better part of 15 years, and I'm presently conducting PhD coursework in a related area, I have no track record of calming such moments or making them better. If there's anything I can say about staying true to yourself in times of stress, it means feeling stress all the more. So you should know up front that this is not going to be a talk about getting rid of stress in times of stress. And it's not a talk about getting or being better in any way, actually. It's about being and staying true to ourselves. And when I say true, I mean true like you are when you're a true friend, when you unequivocally want the best for someone, when you stay by and on their side and have clarity about their goodness even when they can't see it. That's how we're going to try to be true to ourselves. And I probably should be clear about what I mean by stress too. I'm referring to the wide range of everyday stress we experience. The stress we feel when we speak up in a meeting, or the stress we feel worrying about a presentation we have to give in 8 months, and even the stress we feel when we're at our edge. Moments of despair or conflict or meltdown. Before we go further, I want to say something about resonance. See, I learned about resonance when my mom taught me how to tune a guitar. She showed me that I actually didn't have to listen for the string to be in the right pitch. I could actually look at the strings to tell if the guitar was in tune. And that's because when a chord hears itself, it vibrates in resonance. Over this next hour, I'm going to share intuitions, observations, and scholarship that I hope will help us stay truer to ourselves in times of stress. I hope you will take whatever strikes a chord of resonance in you. So I want to start by sharing a realization I had in preparing for this talk. Years ago, I gave a series of talks about institutional change to librarians and museum professionals. I invited folks to become agents of change, and I warned that if they actually considered doing so, there were sharky waters ahead. And I showed this very slide here with the skull and crossbones. I named sharks like, I don't know what I'm doing, and I'm not creative, smart, or insightful enough, and if I fail, I will be ridiculed. And then I revealed to them that those sharks weren't real, that they were just shark suits, and that they could, upon realizing that, move forward despite any fears or doubts. Now, this approach worked for me, and I did some things that were risky and innovative, and I could argue that I helped folks make some real change in museums and libraries with this sort of thinking. But something puzzled me, and it still does. And that is, as aware as I am of these sharks, I've never been able to take the shark suit off. Anytime I face a new challenge, I'm afraid as if I'd learned I was capable of ever facing challenges, even similar ones. In this very talk, that's true. Those same 3 fears I mentioned and first drew years ago are as real to me in the preparation of this talk as they were in that talk when I drew them. Reflecting on this, I've come to wonder if the sharks swimming in the waters aren't fears or doubts, but rather they're actually selves. And I've started to wonder that if in times of stress, it's those selves we must stay true to. What if I'm not good enough is not a false idea, a fear or a doubt, a shark? What if it's a self? What would change if I thought that was who I was in that moment? How would I treat myself? And what would it mean for the times when I'm not good enough is not who I know myself to be? My realization was that perhaps the goal is to not stay true to ourselves in times of stress, but to realize that times of stress evoke many selves that we must recognize and honor and learn from. It isn't that we see a shark, realize it's a suit, and shed the fin to become true, but rather that we see and embrace the bearer of these suits, shark fins and all. So this realization, which is the synthesis of my personal experience and my scholarly pursuits, has led me to a 5-step process for staying true to ourselves in times of stress. And I'd like to spend the rest of this talk exploring each of those steps. We'll return to this slide several times throughout to see where we're headed and remind us of where we've been. But here's the process all laid out. To be true to ourselves in times of stress, first, we have to practice noticing and being present to everyday, not particularly stressful moments of our lives. Then, in moments of stress, we have to notice that we are suffering. Then, in those moments of noticing that we are suffering, we have to notice that we are noticing. Then, we have to respond to ourselves in those moments with kindness. And last, we have to do this over and over again for many years and in the company of trusted friends and mentors. Essentially, I'm saying to stay true to ourselves in times of stress. Sorry about that. Sorry, there we go. Essentially what I'm saying is to stay true to ourselves in times of stress means that we need to cultivate self-awareness and self-compassion. And these are 2 fruits of contemplative practice. And in this talk, I would like to make the case that there are deep and abiding benefits that we will experience if we consider approaching stressful moments contemplatively. And thankfully, there's a lot of scholarship that backs this up too. But I want to give a spoiler alert here, and that is that there actually are some sharky waters ahead. Thomas Merton, who is one of the contemporary world's most famous contemplatives, once described the contemplative experience as follows, I quote, "Let no one hope to find in contemplation an escape from conflict, from anguish, or from doubt. On the contrary, the deep certitude of the contemplative experience awakens a tragic anguish and opens many questions in the depth of the heart like wounds that cannot stop bleeding." As we engage the contemplative to stay true to ourselves, what I'm saying is that we will most likely experience more conflict, more anguish, more doubt, and we may open questions that can never be answered or to which the answers are painful. I think this is why I had such a hard time preparing for this talk, and I really did. I feared that this wasn't the talk that you signed up for. I feared that it wasn't true for everyone. And I also feared that even if it was true for folks, no one would want to hear it. But I realized that if I was going to stay true to myself in this time of stress, this was the talk I had to give. So, our first task in staying true to ourselves in times of stress is to practice noticing and being present to everyday, not particularly stressful moments of our lives. Scholars would call this present moment awareness, and in some cases they might call it mindfulness. And the scholar that's most well known for defining both of those terms is Jon Kabat-Zinn. He's a physician and a researcher, and he's largely credited with bringing mindfulness to the West and to the academy. Kabat-Zinn defines mindfulness as paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. And the gold standard way that Kabat-Zinn and plenty of other researchers propose that we do this is through noticing our breathing, which is a practice that's inspired by Buddhist meditation. But there are actually many, many ways to get better at paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. And since I'm sure all of you have heard of breathing meditation, and many of you have tried it or even practice it regularly, I wanted to frame present moment awareness in a couple of different ways. I think a great way to understand what it means to stay present is to think about a very common occurrence in our lives. And it's those moments where we have to go around in a circle and say something. In fact, if this talk were in person, I would have us break up into small groups and actually experience this for ourselves. I don't know about you, but these moments are always sort of a private hell for me. I spend the entire time either rehearsing what I'm going to say until it's my turn, or rehashing what I've said after I've said it, and hardly ever am I actually listening to what someone is saying. And that's true for when I'm speaking as well. I'm not sure where I go, but I'm not there then either. Thankfully, these occasions are perfect for practicing present moment awareness, because all you have to do is try to listen to whoever's speaking, including yourself, and realize when you aren't listening and come back. Now, it's inevitable in these sorts of situations that your mind will drift, and this is the case in breathing meditation as well. And this tendency to drift is what makes for good awareness building. Finding situations in your life where you're tempted to get lost in your thoughts helps strengthen your attention, because you have to drift in order to strengthen it. It's actually the moments of drift, not the moments of presence, that are the goal. Ming Tan, who's the author of the book Search Inside Yourself, which is about teaching Google engineers to meditate, describes this with a really effective metaphor: weightlifting. This is what Ming writes. He says, "One important similarity between exercise and meditation is that in both cases, growth comes from overcoming resistance. For example, when you're weight training, every time you flex your biceps in resistance to the weight of the dumbbells, your bicep muscles grow a little bit stronger. The same process happens during meditation. Every time your attention wanders away from your breath and you bring it back, it's like flexing your biceps. Your muscle of attention grows a bit stronger." Now, this principle works across all efforts to pay attention, not just breathing meditation. If you're trying to pay attention in a circle of people, realize you're gone, and come back, then you're strengthening that same muscle of attention. One of the reasons why breathing meditation is the go-to example for building present moment awareness is because we're always breathing. So it provides something to always come back to. But there are other ways to achieve this as well. One of my favorites is to pick a shape or an object and notice it everywhere you go. This is a practice I've kept for several years, and it's one that I assign to my students as well. The object that I've chosen to notice is the shape of a heart, and I'll say more about that in a second, but it could be anything. I've had students pick fruit, clouds, colors, and all manner of shapes and sizes, shapes and concepts. This practice gives us something to come back to everywhere we are, and it can be profoundly meaningful. When I first started noticing hearts, and this is the first heart I noticed, it felt like anytime I saw one, I felt a moment of belonging. And that was important to me because I just moved across the country and I was feeling a bit unmoored. And over time, I began to see hearts as a sort of signpost. Anytime I saw one, I felt I was somehow on the right track. But after many years, I've come to realize that when I see a heart, it's a reminder that everywhere I am is the right place. And some of my students have experienced similarly profound results from this practice. For example, a student who chose to notice stars over the course of our quarter wrote this at the end of it. She said, "What started out as me keeping my eyes open for stars turned into me paying more attention to my environment and surroundings and really seeing everything I passed by. I notice things now, not just stars. I notice small tattoos and spelling errors and dust on dumbbells. And I'm so much more aware of everything around me. My noticing of stars turned into noticing my surroundings, which turned into so much more. I began to notice things about myself. I really started noticing moments of gratitude. And not only that, I take the time to reflect on them and appreciate what I'm grateful for. With this being said, I think I can grow to be able to notice moments that aren't so great. There is also value in taking the time to appreciate where I may not be as happy or grateful. The student directly experienced how noticing stars increased her ability to notice more in her life, including her inner life. And the most important thing that happened for her is that she was able to notice moments that aren't so great. And that's exactly the sort of noticing we need to do to stay truer to ourselves in times of stress. You see, it's getting more reliable at noticing the everyday mundane moments that will help us at times when noticing is very hard, like the stressful moments. Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a famous Vietnamese Buddhist monk, famously uses the example of washing the dishes to make this point. I'm going to read something that Thich Nhat Hanh wrote. He wrote, "There are two ways to wash the dishes. The first is to wash the dishes in order to have clean dishes. And the second is to wash the dishes in order to wash the dishes. While washing the dishes, one should only be washing the dishes, which means that while washing the dishes, one should be completely aware of the fact that one is washing the dishes. The fact that I'm standing there and washing these bowls is a wondrous reality. I'm being completely myself, following my breath, conscious of my presence, and conscious of my thoughts and actions. There is no way I can be tossed around mindlessly like a bottle slapped here or there on the waves." Thich Nhat Hanh is showing us how present moment awareness helps us not to be tossed around mindlessly like a bottle on the waves. Washing the dishes mindfully is an excellent practice because it's easier to not be tossed about on a calm sea. If we can work on getting presence in mundane situations, we'll be more likely to stay present when the sea gets stormy. So this brings us to our second point, which is to notice that we are suffering in moments of stress. And to talk about this, I want to introduce Kristen Neff, who is an expert in being mindful in stressful moments. Neff is an educational psychologist at the University of Texas in Austin, and she's developed a framework and an empirically validated way to cultivate self-compassion. Her framework involves three components: mindfulness, kindness, and common humanity. And we're going to address all three of these in this talk, but right now we're going to focus on the first, the mindfulness one. When Neff says that we need mindfulness to be self-compassionate, she means that we need to notice that we're suffering before we can do anything about it. She writes, "Mindfulness is a non-judgmental, receptive mind state in which one observes thoughts and feelings as they are, without trying to suppress or deny them. We cannot ignore our pain and feel compassion for it at the same time. At the same time, mindfulness requires that we not be over-identified with thoughts and feelings so that we are caught up and swept away by negative reactivity." Essentially, what Neff is asking us to do, and what I think is required in order to stay true to ourselves in times of stress, is to be able in those times to notice and name the moment as a moment of suffering. It could be as simple as saying to yourself, "This is a moment of suffering." It can also be helpful, if it feels genuine, to put your hand over your heart or some other gesture that feels comforting. Peter Levine, who's a psychosomatic researcher and psychologist, suggests giving ourselves a big, tight bear hug. In some ways, being present to our pain is natural. I mean, think about how it feels, how hard it is to ignore if you cut your finger or you burn your hand. But in other ways, actually staying present and holding the discomfort of psychologically stressful moments is terribly difficult. And most of us have all sorts of ways to escape or distract ourselves from this. Not to mention that, depending on our personal histories of trauma, distraction and escape may be exactly what we need to do. Neff warns, as Merton did before, that being mindful to painful moments can have a backdraft effect. She says, "Some people find that when they practice self-compassion, their pain actually increases at first. We call this phenomena backdraft, a firefighting term that describes what happens when a door in a burning house is opened. Oxygen goes in and flames rush out. A similar process can occur when we open the door of the heart. Love goes in and old pain comes out." If this happens to you, she recommends backing off, at least temporarily. And indeed, noticing that things are too overwhelming is actually really mindful. So you're still practicing mindfulness in that moment. And backing off is really compassionate. So it may be just the thing that you need. David Trelevin, who's the author of the book Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness, suggests that some mindfulness activities like following the breath or doing a body scan can actually be triggering for some people, just in and of themselves. And those triggers may not be obvious. So I recommend that we be experimental and non-committal as we consider what types of practices we use to cultivate awareness, to try many things to see what feels most resonant. And there's this tool that I love that can help with this. And if we have time at the end, I'll dive really nicely into it so we can see everything on it. It's called the Tree of Contemplative Practice, and it lists practices across a range of secular and religious belief systems. It appeals to a range of personalities and personal motivations. And again, I'll be happy to say more about it later. But right now, what I want the main takeaway to be is that when we move our present moment awareness from easier, more mundane moments to moments in which we are stressed, we have to proceed with caution. And we need a game plan for how to deal with the fact that being present to our pain can be debilitating for some of us. There are many ways to cultivate presence. This tree helps us see that. There are way more ways than just on this tree. And when we cultivate presence as a practice, we strengthen that muscle of attention. One size doesn't fit all here, and it will take practice and experimentation to find the right things that are going to work for you. And that's what I want you to take away from this part. So now we arrive at this critical junction in staying true to ourselves in times of stress. And that is that we must notice that we are noticing that we are suffering. This is important because two very significant things happen when we do. The first thing that happens when we notice that we are noticing is that the stressful moment itself becomes more spacious and we can choose how to engage with it. Thupten Jinpa, the longtime translator for the Dalai Lama, describes this well. He starts with describing how we tend to go about our lives, how life is happening, say we're driving down the highway, and then a person cuts us off and we react. Maybe we yell or gesture in a rude way. And Dr. Jinpa points out that in such moments, the stimuli of life are smashed right up next to our reactions. Life happens, we react. Life happens, we react. Stimulus and response. But he goes on to say that when we practice present moment awareness, we put space between the stimuli and our reactions. The more we practice, the bigger the space gets. And as that space gets bigger, we can do things inside of it. We can hold uncertainty or difficult emotions. We can observe. Essentially, we can respond with intention. Viktor Frankl is credited with describing the power of this space. He said, quote, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space, and that space is our power to choose our response, and our response lies our growth and our freedom." So let's look at what it might mean to hold discomfort in that space instead of reacting right away. And there's a poem that I think speaks to this beautifully, and I imagine many of you have heard it before. It's called The Guest House, and it's by Rumi, as translated by Coleman Barks. And I'm going to read it to you now. This being human is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. Even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture, still treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. Rumi is asking us to welcome whoever we are in our moments of stress, to meet ourselves at the door laughing and invite us in, even if the version of ourselves that we're meeting is someone we are ashamed to be. It's not only that those versions of ourselves are important to acknowledge, they're most likely the reasons we have survived our messy lives in the first place. Some of our sharkiest selves were our first and fiercest protectors. We not only owe those parts of ourselves recognition, we owe them deep gratitude. Noticing these sharky protectors illustrates the second thing that can happen when we notice that we are noticing. We can realize that there's actually two selves involved. There's the self that is suffering, the shark, let's say, and there's the self that is watching the shark. So in addition to allowing us to hold discomfort, noticing that we are noticing allows us to hold complexity. We're capable of being multiple selves at the same time, even multiple selves that contradict each other. We can be a person with great strengths and a person with great weaknesses. We can hold both at once in that space, or at least we can try. What's more, our watching self has the ability to help the shark, the suffering self, in such moments. And in particular, it can embrace that self and treat it with compassion and kindness, which brings us to our penultimate point. To stay true to ourselves in times of stress, we must respond to ourselves in these moments with kindness. And this takes us back to Kristin Neff's framework for self-compassion. Her second component, which is kindness, is pretty, her definition of it sets a pretty low bar. She basically says that to be kind to ourselves in a moment of suffering, we simply have to avoid being cruel to ourselves. She suggests that one way to do this is to treat ourselves as we would a good friend, to actually have a conversation with ourselves, either out in our head or out loud, and pretend that we're talking to a friend that's going through the same exact situation. Personally, I have found that a method that Dr. Peter Attia uses helps me the most. It may sound silly, but this is actually what I do. I create a voice memo on my phone and I leave myself a message. And I pretend that I'm talking to this person that I unequivocally admire and wish the best for, who is my friend Erin. Just so happens to be how I feel about her. And so I pretend that I'm talking to her. And I tell myself whatever I would tell her if she were in that situation. There's something, for me at least, about getting out my phone and recording that message that makes it feel more consequential. Contemplative practices can also help us in these moments. In particular, practices that help us generate feelings of compassion. And there's a generative branch that we'll talk about in a little bit. So for example, when I'm experiencing stress, I often use free writing as a way to process it. And free writing is just a practice of writing whatever's on our minds without pausing to really think about it and just stream of consciousness, right? I can write to myself for guidance and comfort, and I can be completely honest with myself about whatever it is I'm feeling, because I'm the only one who can see it. It's sort of become a trusted space to have a conversation with myself when I free write, when I'm feeling stress. But in particularly stressful times, I take this up a notch, and I free write in a way that I learned from Tara Sophia Marr's book, Playing Big. In her book, Marr takes us through a practice called visualization, and that's also on the tree of contemplative practices. You visualize yourself many years from now. I tend to visualize myself as an 80-year-old elder. And then I free write a letter to my elder self and tell her what's going on. And then she free writes back to my present self with advice and comfort. Writing in this way gives me the perspective of time, the wisdom of old age, and a sense that whatever I'm going through, I'm going to survive it because she did. On her website, Kristin Neff also offers several short guided meditations called self-compassion breaks. And if we have time, we'll actually do one of them today. You can listen to these as well in times of stress. They walk you through generating feelings of kindness towards yourself. They remind you to be mindful, to be kind. And that can be really hard to do on our own. And on her website, she also has this empirically validated self-compassion quiz. And it helps you see, based on your behaviors, where you are in terms of her framework. How mindful do you tend to be? How kind do you tend to be? That sort of thing. And it helps you to see where you might have areas to grow. For some of us, being kind to ourselves is really going to be a challenge. I know it is for myself. But it's the essential component of being true to ourselves in times of stress. And I just want you to know that there are a lot of resources available to us to practice and become better skilled at it. Excuse me. So here we are at the last piece of staying true to ourselves in times of stress. And honestly, I think it's the most challenging. And that's the time and people it'll take to actually work. This is not something that happens overnight. In fact, progress in these terms is better measured in years or even decades. It's not something you can do alone either. It requires relationships with mentors and peers. And possibly most challenging of all is that most of the time that you're trying this, it's going to feel like failing. But we have already learned that where contemplative practice is concerned, sometimes failure is exactly what we want to happen. Remember when at the beginning I was describing how we need to get better at noticing and how we need to have these moments of drift so that we have the resistance to overcome, like the bicep and the dumbbell? That same principle is true here. There are so many layers to the process I have described. Noticing in everyday life, noticing when suffering, noticing when noticing, being kind. Each of these steps is terrifically complex. They would meet even the most masterful person wherever they are with just the very challenge that they need to grow. So when we fail in this realm, we strengthen our ability to try again. With contemplative practices, having a strong try again muscle is the thing you need to sustain and deepen a practice. Sometimes we'll have aha moments or times where we feel like we've made some major realization that will carry with us forever, but more often than not, we forget and re-realize even those most profound insights many, many times over. Growing in awareness and compassion takes time, likely on the order of decades. And I wouldn't want you moving on from this talk without that expectation. In addition to time, the work requires community. And this is something that I personally feel gets a little lost in the scholarship. But if we look to ancient wisdom traditions and indigenous communities and world religions, we see that traditions never center the individual as much of the mindfulness movement tends to do. They center the community, and they distinguish between teachers and students. As we grow to be truer to ourselves, we're essentially growing in awareness and connection. And growing in awareness and connection is, in my opinion, arguably a spiritual endeavor, whatever spiritual means to you. Our wisdom traditions are universally on the same page here. In spiritual growth and direction, we need ancestors, mentors, teachers, peers, friends, strangers. We need to belong to a community of people who are also trying to grow and being true to themselves. And we need exemplars to model and learn from. You can't get very far in this work alone. And that actually echoes the third and final component of Neff's framework for self-compassion, which is that in moments of suffering, we must not only realize that we're suffering and be kind to ourselves, we must realize our common humanity. We're never alone in our suffering, even if the details feel very specific to us and our lives. And suffering itself is part of being human. It's something that everyone goes through. This realization is part of what fueled the courage it took to give this talk for me, knowing that among the people listening in, there would be folks here that my experience would resonate with. I'm not alone in how I struggle and how I feel about it, even if those sharkier parts of me are convinced that I am. So, as a way of wrapping up this part of the talk, let's return to the 5-step process for staying true to ourselves in times of stress and remember what we've covered. First, we have to practice noticing and being present to everyday, not particularly stressful moments of our lives. This is where we discuss building the muscle of attention, noticing objects or shapes in everyday lives, doing mundane things like washing the dishes mindfully. Then, in moments of stress, we have to notice that we are suffering. And this is where we discussed how challenging it can be to experience suffering in stressful moments and how we have to proceed with caution, especially if we have trauma in our histories. Then, in moments of noticing that we are suffering, we have to notice that we are noticing. And this is where we discussed widening the space between stimulus and response, and where we realize that we can watch ourselves when we're suffering, and the watcher can help. Then we have to respond to ourselves in those moments with kindness. And this is where we learned about the different ways to cultivate kindness towards ourselves, like talking to ourselves as we would to a friend, or writing to ourselves from an older and wiser place. And last, we have to do this over and over again for many years in the company of trusted friends and mentors. And this is where we acknowledge that growth in these areas takes time and community. So, speaking personally, preparing and delivering this talk has been comically stressful for me, but it was just what I needed to distill and synthesize years of thinking that I didn't realize was related until I was given the opportunity to reflect on these things and the responsibility of offering the talk. I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation and to everyone here for listening. And I'm going to pause now to invite questions that you have. And then after we satisfy any questions that are in the room, I'd like to then take you on that deeper tour of the tree of contemplative practices. And then if we still have time, also do a self-compassion break from Dr. Neff. So for right now, I'm going to say you can find all my contact information at becktench.com. And I'm going to switch to slide with all the references that I mentioned during the talk so that those of you who want to follow up in that way have that information for your notes. And so now I'm going to open it back up to the room and see if there are any questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Beck, and thank you for sharing those resources on the screen as well. Beck, are those resources included in your slideshow as well that we will be posting?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So don't feel like you have to scribble these down or even take a screenshot. Those will be in the slide presentation. If you do have a question, feel free to submit it in the question box. One of the questions that came in is it possible to be too much in the present moment so that you don't make plans, e.g. to care for yourself and family in the future? I feel years have flown by while I've been so much in the moment that I missed some goals that can't be regained. Am I misinterpreting?
It's hard to say without more context, but what this point reminds me of, and I think is very important to talk about, is a concept called spiritual bypassing. And spiritual bypassing is when, and I think it's a particular vulnerability of the mindfulness movement, because the mindfulness movement has been completely plucked out of its origin context and put into a population that doesn't operate the ways that the origin context does. So it just doesn't, some things just get lost in translation. And so what can happen is we check out in a moment of stress, or we're too present, as I'm hearing this person say. And when we are that way, we're actually almost in that kind of like blissing out, not trying to, just trying to focus so that you don't feel. You're actually quite closed, only open to peace and calm or something like that. And the kind of presence that I'm talking about here, in particular moments of stress, is a presence that doesn't feel like that at all. It feels like it's amplifying things in your life or in the circumstance or whatever that are difficult. So you're not bypassing them, you're opening to them. So the visual would be, if I had a whiteboard and could show you, I would show an arrow, and I'd show a little square and then have an arrow that just goes right around the square versus an arrow that goes right to the square and looks. So in a sense, if you're present in that way, my understanding and experience has been that you don't miss things. It can be paralyzing when you have so many things that you don't miss. And that is where the practice becomes this sort of accordion of complexity. It's what I was trying to say before about how it'll meet you where you are. So if it becomes overwhelming and you just notice too much, you do what Neff says and you back away and you say, the mindful thing to notice here is I'm overwhelmed, and you meet being overwhelmed with what it needs to help you to calm down. But essentially, there aren't beautiful answers here. It is messiness here, because emotions and hurt and things that you miss are messy. And if I lived a life where I thought I had really missed things, that'd be the work I'd be doing right now. That'd be what I'd be opening up to right in this very moment, to say, what do I feel when I look at that? And how might I want to understand what selves are showing up, why they're showing up, what that means for who I am, and how I want to include them moving forward, perhaps in different ways.
Thank you. We have another question. How do people who fall, get up and continue, yet still feel as if they are in the stage of actively falling, break away, and they don't seem to learn from experience?
So this question is asking, what happens when you fall and you just get back up again and you don't learn from the experience, and then you fall and you get back up again and you don't learn from the experiences? Do you read that in that, Jamie, or is there something I'm missing?
Yes, and this person is confirming yes.
Okay. So, I think that there's another lost in translation and component of a lot of this work that can happen, which is that somehow we, like, when you fall and get back up again and fall and get back up again, what's the point? And I think that the point is that I guess what I'm trying to say is that in a situation like that, if I were to be that person, but I'm presuming maybe I don't know, maybe you're seeing that in yourself or you are observing it in someone else. My understanding is that in situations like that, whoever it is, it's either me or it's another person, is doing the absolute best that they can. And that if I were them, I'd be doing exactly what they were doing. That's just a particular idea I have about how the world works. If I'd lived exactly their same life, etc. And I think that for my own personal experiences of watching myself repeat the things that I do not want to happen in moments of stress over and over and over again, I really have the perspective of time in my pocket to say that things are moving and I need to just continue to try, pay attention, and continue to try. I really don't feel in my heart that if I am the one perpetuating this failure over and over again, that the failures are somehow for naught and that I shouldn't be doing that. I should be intervening in some major way. I don't even know how I would, honestly. I think, I have had some significant changes in my life. For example, I lost a bunch of weight a whole bunch of years ago. And the change in my attitude towards food has happened so slowly that I wouldn't in any given day be able to really see. But looking over 17 years, I can say, wow, this is actually quite different. And I think that that's how this works too. I personally, I could say, every time I failed to eat the thing that I wanted to eat, that I was somehow making a judgment about who I was in that moment. That's not fair and it's not accurate. It's a collection of long-term observation that shows you where the needle is. And I just personally feel like attempts to try again are looked over time, you might actually see something moving that you wouldn't see in any one moment. I hope that helps. That's how I see it.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, what would you say to someone that says, this looks way too hard, I could never do this, and this person tears themselves down before we even start?
Hmm. These are hard questions. I love them. I mean, okay, if it were me and another person came to me and said, this looks too hard, and they tear it down, personally, I'm going to think that's where they are. I think that if I were a person reacting to this and saying, this looks too hard, my recommendation to myself and in all of this is of course to start small and just see what happens. I am, my background is in creating exhibits for science museums, and despite my kind of leanings towards the more mysterious concepts, I'm definitely a scientist at heart, and I look at these sorts of situations as experiments. And I mean, what I'm talking about representing in terms of the difficulties I had creating this talk and the things that I have learned over these years about these areas, I like, what's the alternative? Are you just going to continue to be the person that you don't want to be or feel horrible? Because like that's kind of how it feels. It's like, I want to be kinder to myself. That's what I want for myself. And I know that like being kinder to myself will help me be kinder to people. And when I look at the life that I want to live, kindness is kind of like the most beautiful thing I've ever participated in. And so it's really hard to be kind to myself. And I imagine some of you are the same way. I see it a lot in librarians. I'm just saying, it's hard to be kind to ourselves. We have a personality type, I'm not sure, but it's a hard thing. And they're like, the best stuff in life is hard. Like there's no reason to not give something a try just because it's hard. It's just, how do you approach it? And approaching it in a way that feels like you're not falling off a cliff every time you fall down is probably wise. And that's why I put that stuff in there about the trauma and about, if you feel that backdraft effect, stop, because it's real. If you open yourself to painful moments, you'll feel pain more. That's what's going to happen. But I think that we've got to connect with the fact that we're hurting so that we can be kind to ourselves. If we just deny those things, then we're actually cruel, or we can be, some of us. So it is hard. I would say you're right about that, but I don't think that's any reason not to try it.
Thank you. And this person said that your response was helpful. So thank you. I want to read a couple comments that came through. Someone said, Beck, your voice is so soothing. This is an excellent presentation, and thank you so much for your research and dedication. Another person said that your last comment said, that made me weep. Kindness is the most beautiful thing I've ever participated in. So we have just over 10 minutes left. And so I'm wondering if you mentioned 2 activities that we could do. Is there time for one of the 2, or maybe both?
Yes, there is.
Okay.
I think we can do both. Let's do that.
Okay.
Great.
All right.
Okay. Just such great contributions. Thanks to everyone for those questions. So with this time, I want to just share a little bit more about the Tree of Contemplative Practices, because it really is a wonderful tool that I want people to know about. It's created by the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, which is contemplativemind.org. And in particular, it was created by this researcher here, Maya Dur. And she interviewed dozens of contemplatives across a wide range of backgrounds: indigenous, secular, religious. And then she mapped the practices that they did across 7 major themes or branches and 2 major elements or roots. So I love this tree because if fed by these 2 roots here at the bottom, awareness and connection, anything can be contemplative. So I like to use the example of running. We can run and it's just an exercise, but if we run to cultivate connection to the people we pass by, or if we run to connect with the environment that we're running in, then we're connecting, we're running to connect. And if we run with fostering awareness of how it feels in our body to run, or we run and think about the emotions that we're experiencing while we run, then we're running to cultivate awareness of our mind and body. And so running with those sorts of cultivations is running contemplatively. So running can be exercise, but it could also be a completely contemplative experience. And I also love this tree because it demonstrates this huge variety of what can be considered contemplative. It doesn't have to just be sitting on a cushion, counting your breath like the magazines show us. It can be things like meditation or centering prayer, that the things that are on this branch here at the bottom left, stillness. But it can also be things like on the generative branch, things like the more visualization, where you imagine yourself as an older person, or the practice of Lectio Divina, where you read something very slowly. I've actually written a blog post called Reading is Useless that talks about the process of contemplative reading of academic texts of all things, just to appreciate and slow down. If you're a maker, which so many librarians are, if you knit or sew or build, you can practice those things focusing on the process of making instead of the thing that you're making, kind of like how Thich Nhat Hanh said, to wash the dishes. You knit the sweater to knit the sweater, to cultivate connection and awareness. For those of us who identify as activists or volunteers or workers, that kind of work can be profoundly connecting and awareness building. Acts of service, acts of protest can be a contemplative practice. For others, practices that involve people, it's just like so many of this stuff is siloed. But I think some of the most in connection with another person. And so something like empathetic listening or storytelling on the relational branch can be just ridiculously contemplative. That's a funny phrase, ridiculously contemplative. Then like running, I mentioned before, practices on the movement branch, dance or yoga or labyrinth walking that connect you with your body as a way to experience connection and awareness are possibilities. And then practices on the ritual and cyclical branch. This is probably my favorite branch. Things that you either do alone or in community to mark the passage of time or the daily routines of life or major milestones can be contemplative. And that's not to say that like any of these are siloed. Many practices that we have belong on multiple branches. It's just that they got placed on a specific branch because it was predominantly that kind of theme. So my point is that there are many ways to practice cultivating awareness, and finding the right practice for use an experiment that can last many years and evolve over time. And as I said when we were talking about that backdraft effect, that you should hold these things lightly. You see all these apps that want you to just sort of habituate to some mindfulness practice right away forever. Don't do that. Build your try again muscle, but hold these things lightly and just be experimental and see what resonates for you before really, it'll stick. If it works for you, it'll stick and you'll do it. You don't have to force this stuff. So my question for the group, and you can maybe put it in the chat, is which branch feels most like you? Are you most like relational? Are you most like creative or stillness? And which one is most challenging for you? I'm definitely not a generative, or I'm definitely not a movement person. And so I just wanted you to reflect that back to me to help me understand where you are, and then I have a recommendation for you.
Okay, so if you would like to share in the question area, which branch do you identify with the most and why? And then the second part of that is which branch challenges you the most and why? So maybe put a 1 or a 2 by your along with your response.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
So I know which one you're referring to. Okay, so I am seeing some come in. Let's see. Let's go with the positive, the branch you can identify. I'm seeing a creative, a movement, a creative, activist, relational, movement, stillness, 2 more: creative, relational, movement. Creative. And then as far as challenges, I'm seeing ritual, activist, stillness, movement, ritual, stillness, activities, stillness, relational, stillness, relational, generative, activist. Oh, several more: stillness.
Interesting.
Yeah, stillness.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like, you know, if we were to do just a quick analysis, it might be like we're heavy on the creative comfort zone and heavy on the stillness discomfort zone, with some shoulders there that feel, you know, relational and activist might be a little bit challenging, and movement and I guess movement was the other one that felt like there was several people that said that they identified with it. And relational, I think people may have said. So what the point is that I wanted to make by asking this question is that if you have that instinct to say, this is me and this isn't me, use both of those. Those are mirror images of one another in some way. And for some people, it's going to be stillness is the hardest for me and stillness is the easiest for me. So it also could be the case that one branch is hard and easy for you. And I just want to invite you to read yourself, check in with yourself, and say, am I up for a challenge or do I need to be in my comfort zone? And wherever you are, go with that. So go with what feels right if you feel that there's one that you identify with, or go with what challenges you if you feel that you've got it in you to have a challenge right now, because having that information is probably tugging you at a place that has some resonance to it, even though it may feel like a challenge. And I just wanted to point that out. So it looks like we have 3 minutes left. Shall I go ahead and try the very last thing, kind of just do it quickly?
Yeah, let's try it.
Okay. So this last thing is just we're going to do a quick version, a 2-minute version of the self-compassion break, which is by Kristen Neff, and you can listen to this on her website. So what we have to do this is we need to call up a moment of suffering. This is how we're going to end this talk. So we're going to call up a moment of suffering. So what I want you to do is to think of a situation in your life right now that is difficult. And it might be something that you're feeling stress about, or it might be a relationship problem or something that you're worried might happen. But I want you to think of something that's difficult, but not overwhelmingly difficult. So, you know, something that you could think on without breaking down. And what I want you to do when you have that situation is I want you to get in touch with it. So what is actually happening, or what happened, or what might happen? Who said what? Just bring that situation to life in your mind's eye. And what I want to do next is I want to run through a series of phrases that Kristen Neff has us focus on in these self-compassion breaks where we're thinking about this hard thing we're going through. So the first thing is we say, this is a moment of suffering. This is the mindfulness part that we talked about before. We're being mindful of the fact that this thing that's bothering me is a moment of suffering. And you can use whatever kind of language that speaks to you. You could say something like, this is really hard, or I'm really struggling with this. But we're turning towards the hard thing and we're just naming it. This is a moment of suffering. And then the second thing, the common humanity thing, is to say, suffering is a part of life. We're reminding ourselves that for all humans, it's common humanity thing. Suffering is a part of life. And you can find your own language for this. You might say something like, this is not abnormal to feel this way, or people go through similar situations. Yeah, the degree of suffering may be different, or the flavor of suffering may be different, but suffering is a part of life, a part of being human. And then the last thing, the third phrase is, may I be kind to myself in this moment. And to support bringing kindness to yourself, you're thinking of that thing. I invite you to put your hand over your heart or some other place on your body that feels soothing and comforting. You feel the warmth of your hands, gentleness of the touch, and let feelings of care stream through your fingers to yourself. May I be kind to myself. And you can use language that supports any sense of kindness that works for you. It needs to feel authentic. Maybe something you would say to a good friend, like, I'm here for you. It's going to be okay. I care about you. You could use a diminutive, something like, darling, I'm so sorry. Or you could call yourself by your name, which is what I do. Whatever feels natural to express your deep wish that you are well and happy and free from suffering. So that's it. As you let go of this practice, you say those three things to yourself after you come up with what the thing is that's hard. You just allow however you're feeling to be. You don't need to change anything about how you're feeling, just to pay attention to it. And that is enough self-compassion break. You can do that with 2 minutes if you have it in a moment of suffering.
Wow, I don't know if I'm the only one, but when you told me to put my hand on my heart and to talk about kindness, I felt tears come to my eyes.
Beautiful, Jamie.
So thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you so much, Beck, for a great closing session. I think this was the perfect way to end this 2 days of information gathering and to end this conference. As mentioned, someone said, can we please clone this woman and make her a world leader? Oh, I love it. As we mentioned, the session recording and slides will be posted on the conference website by tomorrow. There will also be a short survey that will pop up on your screen after we close, and it will be emailed to you. So we really do appreciate your feedback. I want to thank all of you for being part of this conference with us the last 2 days. I want to thank you for your participation, your questions, your input, your comments. You are really what make a conference fantastic. Of course, it's about great content and great presenters, but it's also all of you and your participation that really makes it wonderful. So please continue to be proud of yourselves and the great work that you are doing. Continue to take care of yourselves. Whatever that means, continue to stay healthy. And we wish all of you a great rest of your day, a great rest of your week. And again, thanks for being with us so long.
Thank you. Bye.